Hey y'all, welcome back to the Greg Brownerville Dimension. In recent episodes, I've been talking a lot about these Welsh folk tales from the 19th century in which ladies of the Tylwyth Teg, that is Welsh fairy women, wind up marrying mortal men, usually Welsh farmers. And I was looking back at one that was written down by Wiert Sykes in the 19th century. Just the other day, I was revisiting this and noticing something curious in the story. So, in this story, this young farmer is out in the countryside near a lake called Llyn Ifan Fach, and he sees a fairy woman admiring herself using the water as a mirror. She's looking at herself in the water, admiring herself, and he walks up, and pretty soon he's admiring her too, and he falls in love with her at first sight and wants to marry her. And he has some bread with him that he had carried along for his lunch, and he offers it to her. But she says, Kras devara need have vinala, meaning your bread is baked too hard and it's not easy to catch me. So he goes home and he's feeling all dejected. He talks to his mama about it. And his mama tells him, well, maybe tomorrow you should go back and just bring some dough, not even baked. So he does that. And he sees the fairy woman again. He presents her with the unbaked dough. And this time she says, Llaeth devara, tinivana, meaning something like, now your bread is just dough. That's not going to cut it. I won't have you. So he goes home again, all dejected, talks to his mama, and the way Wiert Sykes words it, his mother suggests that his bread should the next time be but slightly baked, as most likely to please the mysterious being. So he goes back the next day with moderately baked bread. He presents it to the fairy lady, and she accepts it and agrees to marry him. And I thought, what is going on? Like, why is there so much emphasis so much weight being placed on whether or not this guy can produce the perfect golden brown bread? I mean, I guess feeding the family is important, and she likes her bread the way she likes it. But it seemed to me that there was something else going on, and I felt that some distant memory was being activated. I was like, this is reminding me of something that I've read before, and I finally realized what it was. Some years ago, I came across a Filipino folktale about the high god called Kabunian, I think was his name. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. If any of you is familiar with Filipino folklore and can correct my pronunciation, leave a comment and let me know how I'm supposed to say it. But it's spelled like Kabunian. And this god, he seems to be like the main god of this mythological world. He gets lonesome and he wants some company. So he decides that he's going to try to create some beings that can keep him company. So he makes a man-shaped cookie and puts it in the oven. And then he goes out and is wandering around in the outdoors, playing around. Actually, it says he tours the earth for his amusement. And he forgets about his cookie. And so he rushes back home and thinks, oh no, I think I've left it in there too long. And sure enough, the thing is burnt, but it's still good. And he thinks, this is an amazing creation, even though it's not exactly what I was thinking. So he breathes life into it. And this becomes the progenitor of the darker races. And then he makes another man-shaped cookie, puts it in the oven, and this time he's so worried about overcooking it that he undercooks it, and it comes out all like pale and uncooked, and it's just not satisfactory, but he still thinks it's kind of amazing, so he breathes life into it, and these become this becomes the progenitor of the Caucasian races. Then he tries a third time, and this time he's really got it figured out, and this one comes out just right. Golden brown, and this becomes the progenitor of the father of the Filipino race. So anyway, I'm wondering, is the Welsh folktale tapping into the same lore? Because this story of the three races and the baking of the human, the kind of cookie human being, That is by no means limited to the Filipino culture. I've seen it in Native American stories. I think the Pueblos have a story that's very similar. I think the Seminoles do too. Could be wrong with that, but I believe I've come across it. It seems to be pretty widespread, this idea. And it made me think of a book that I came across last year. There's a book called Policing Pregnant Bodies. The subtitle is From Ancient Greece to Post-Roe America. This is by a scholar at University of Oklahoma named Kathleen Crowther. I think she's at OU. I could be wrong about that. But anyway, Kathleen Crowther is her name. And I read an interview with her on NPR about this book. And let me just read some of what she says about her book. She's thinking about this phrase, bun in the oven, like when people say that a woman has a bun in the oven, meaning that she's pregnant. I grew up hearing that expression. I never liked it. And Kathleen Crowther definitely doesn't like it, and this is what she has to say about it. It's a kind of cutesy little way of saying that someone is pregnant to say they have a bun in the oven. That metaphor is really old. This is still Kathleen Crowther talking. It first appears in texts by Hippocrates about 2,000 years ago to describe the process of gestation. But if you think about that, if you've baked bread, the real work of baking bread goes on before you put it in the oven, the proofing the yeast and kneading the dough. That work takes time. It takes skill. It takes effort. Once you put the dough in the oven, all you're doing is waiting. This is still Kathleen Crowther talking. So why do we use that metaphor to describe pregnancy, she asks. That suggests that the active work has been done presumably by the man, and then the uterus is just like this incubator that's growing this thing that was already made. I don't think most people who use that metaphor are being misogynistic, but I think it actually does come from a deeply misogynistic tradition of thinking about women's bodies as passive, unquote. Okay, so that's Kathleen Crowther on this idea of gestation as being like baking bread. And if it's true that that metaphor is in play in the Welsh folktales, then you can start to understand why it's so important to the fairy woman that the man knows how to bake the bread properly, because maybe she's admiring herself in the water and she's thinking, I want children. If I'm going to marry this man, I want to make sure that I can produce children who look like me. I explored in a previous episode some possibilities to the effect that maybe the Tylwyth Teg, the Welsh fairies, are descended from the Trojans. There is medieval folk history around this idea that the Welsh are Anatolian, that they're really Trojan people. And I was reading Gerald of Wales on this, and there does seem to be some racial pride. He's Welsh, Gerald of Wales, mixed Welsh and Norman descent, but he definitely sides with the Welsh over the English. And there does seem to be some racial pride coming out in his description of the coloration of the Welsh. So this is what he says. This is from the medieval period. He says, the English retain their outward fairness of complexion and their inward coldness of disposition from what nature had given them earlier on, because he's talking about how they're of the Saxon race. And so he's kind of taking a shot here at the English. He says, the Britons, meaning the Welsh, on the contrary, transplanted from the hot and arid regions of the Trojan plain, keep their dark coloring, which reminds one of the earth itself, their natural warmth of personality. And I was reading a study from 2019, I think it was published in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, that shows that the Neolithic farmers who arrived in Britain about 4000 BC do seem to be Anatolian genetically, because these ancient human remains have been discovered in Britain. These are basically the people who built Stonehenge. They were part of this massive movement of population out of the Anatolian region across Europe. It started around 6000 BC. They arrived in Britain around 4000 BC, and they were darker skinned according to the genetic studies. And even the hunter-gatherers in Britain, represented by, say, Cheddar Man, whose ancient remains were unearthed some while ago in Britain, were dark skinned. So there is this heritage there that has to do with darker coloration. And if the Tylwyth Teg, as we discussed in a previous episode, are in some fashion descended from or mystically associated with or folklorically associated with those early Britons who were darker skinned, then maybe this whole idea of wanting the bread to be perfectly golden brown is related to this kind of racial pride that has to do with coloration. And if that that whole metaphor of gestation as being like making bread does emphasize the man's role, as Kathleen Crowther says, then it would be very important to this fairy woman that this young Welshman be able to produce the offspring she's looking for and that she's hoping for, who would be darker skinned. And some of you who know your Welsh may be thinking, well, Tylwyth Teg means fair tribe or fair family, so wouldn't the fairy lady be fair? Well, Teg, the word there that means fair in Welsh, doesn't mean fair-skinned. It means fair as in beautiful, and there may be valences that have to do with like justice. But I talked with some friends of mine who are Welsh scholars, and none of us thinks that Teg means fair as in pale. In fact, one of my friends who's a scholar in this area, he said he just doesn't see that as a possibility at all. There's nothing in the linguistic record to suggest that. So, just an interesting possibility here as to why there's this whole sequence in these Welsh folk tales in which the young Welshman has to show that he can bake bread properly before the fairy woman will marry him. All right, y'all. Well, that's all I've got for you today. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.